So in this presentation, we're going to look at how we actually go about evaluating the guidance that we create. So I'm going to give you a sort of basic introduction to some approaches to evaluation. So when you're thinking about evaluating any kind of practice, the first thing is to think about why evidence actually matters at all. So if you think of two people and they're lost in a maze and they desperately need to get out, and one of them decides that what he's going to do is to gradually make a map, and the other one decides that he's going to run around as quickly as possible and try and find the way out. We would probably expect that the person who carefully makes a map would make slower progress at first, but would ultimately find their way out more quickly than the person who just runs around, unless that person happened to be particularly lucky. So evaluation is basically this principle. It's the idea that as we go, we should be thinking about what we're doing, where we're going, how it's working, and that ultimately that's going to lead us to more effective kinds of practice. And one of the dangers, I think, when you're involved in practice is that it's very easy to just keep trying things and to feel that you don't have time for evaluation. But it's actually really important to devote some time to it, because it will really make what you're doing better. So the first thing I think is that we would want you to think about how to make use of evidence that exists already. So, reading evidence, as you've been doing in the course, making use of it in your programs that you're designing, passing it on, talking about how you used it, participating in research projects and trials where academics might be doing those kinds of things, evaluating your practice, which is what we're going to look at here, and then evaluating your own or developing your own research. There's an important distinction here. I would say evaluation is definitely a type of research, but it's not all types of research. You might do research for quite a wide range of reasons. You might just want to find things out. You might want to explore new ideas. Evaluation has the idea in it that you've done something. You've done a piece of practice. You've tried something out. And what you're trying to figure out is whether it works. So when you're evaluating, the first thing then is to start with existing evidence. Evaluation is much more effective if it builds on existing research. So if you've got a good theory that underpins the intervention that you've built, then that's really powerful. So we've been talking a lot in this course about instructional design as a kind of guiding principle. One of the ideas of instructional design is that you design your learning carefully to meet learners' needs. And one of the things that you should really try and do is to draw in existing evidence as part of that. So there's lots of sources of useful literature. Obviously, we've provided you with quite a lot through the course of this program, but you can also go online and find various things. Here's a few examples. I've put them into the reading list for the course, so there's lots more information that you could see there as well. So, okay, let's think about how evaluation works. Well, the first thing is to recognize that evaluation is not something that you wait until the end of a program to do. It's not something that you do after the fact. Evaluation is actually a cycle, and it's something that's ongoing. So if we start with the cycle of continuous improvement, and what this says is that the way that we should develop learning, and in fact develop almost anything, is to start with a plan. We start with what we're trying to achieve. Again, this is very much a kind of an integrated guidance, an instructional design kind of idea. We start with a plan. We think about we think about it. We think about what we want to do, and then we actually go out and we do it, and we try it. And we recognize that when we're designing learning, we can't get it right all the time. And so we need to actually go and experiment in the field. And that's why this is a cycle, because once we've done something, we then check it, we see if it's working, and we then act to make changes that then influence our next round of planning. So we never get a course right in the first go. It always continues to improve, it always continues to develop, and that's why we've got this idea of a cycle of continuous improvement. Now, there are various ways that we can think about the evaluation cycle, but what we've done here is to turn the evaluation cycle into, turn the cycle of continuous improvement into an evaluation cycle. So In stage one, when we're planning, we want to be reviewing existing evidence, as I've talked about, developing a theory of change, which I'll go on to explain, and deciding on your overall evaluation approach. You then, when you're actually doing the activity, you want to be collecting data, monitoring against your theory of change, and then you want to be analysing data, developing recommendations, reporting on your evaluation, and finally disseminating your findings and implementing your new recommendations. So this is the kind of evaluation cycle, and what it really makes very clear is that evaluation is not something we do at the end. It absolutely needs to be built in from the beginning. So part of the instructional design that you do should be building a parallel evaluation strategy. Now, while integrated guidance isn't entirely about digital and online sources, we've been using those things a lot in the course, and we've been getting you to think about it. And it's certainly one of the new aspects that we've tried to introduce you to that is perhaps unique about this way of thinking about integrated guidance. So this is useful because digital data and digital interventions offer you some very particular and useful opportunities. Particularly, they tend to capture a lot of data. So you can look for things like who has logged on, how many times, what of the resources have they engaged with, how have they done in any quizzes that you might have set. Remember, we've got these kind of automated interactions that we've been talking about. Perhaps you've set some of those. What scores have people been getting? Is it what you thought they should have been getting? What particularly engaged them? What did they use a lot? What did they stay looking at for a long while? And what did not engage them? Now, you'll probably need a bit of help if you've never used digital data before to understand how the tools actually work. But what you'll tend to find is that most of the tools that you have will, by default, will collect a lot of data about the ways in which the individual has engaged with these kinds of resources. And that's data that you can pull out and use as part of your monitoring and evaluation. So let's introduce you to one of the key ideas that I think can be useful to you in thinking about how you build evaluations, and that's the idea of designing a theory of change. So a theory of change describes the steps that need to take place between what you do and the impact that you hope to achieve. It helps you to think about what you're doing and why, and it also helps you to establish a framework for evaluation and quality assurance. So when I'm talking about building an evaluation strategy as part of the kind of original instructional design of your integrated guidance intervention, one of the key things that you're doing is constructing a theory of change. So what does a theory of change look like? Well, this would be quite a basic one, but it would be a good example. So if we think about this, let's start at the end of this. And in the end of our theory of change, we might say, well, what we want is for learners to find a job. We'll come back to how we measure that in a second. And we say, well, okay, if learners are going to find a job, we would want them to be using the internet to find career information. Now, of course, we might want them to be doing other things as well, but that would be one of the key things. We would then say, well, okay, if they're going to be using the internet to find career information, we would want them to be able to describe some of the key sources of career information. And in order to do that, we would need to have provided them with some information or sources of information. But if we're going to be running some kind of online course, perhaps, to teach them this, we need them to be able to use the technology, and we also, first and foremost, need them to be enrolled in the course. So what we've done is work back from the objective that we want to think about the steps that lead us there. So if we think about then how we might measure these things in our evaluation, it's relatively easy for us to find out how many learners enroll in the course. We can just count how many there are. We can also see whether they can use the technology that the course uses, because we can see how many enrolled users start actually engaging with it. We can also do things like monitor the number of queries that we might get. We then can look at what information is provided, and we can say, well, what did we actually give them, but also how much of it was used, how many of these pieces of information that we provided were read, how many times was the lecture that we gave them downloaded or listened to. And then we might have some kind of assessment which looks at how many posts they might make in discussion groups, what's the quality of their discussion, and so on. We then would like them to use the internet to find career information, so we can again see whether we might be able to looking anywhere whether we can measure that or see that through the tools that we've got. But if not, we can do a survey and ask them to report back on how they've been using the information that we've given them in the course. And then, of course, we can do a post-course survey to find out whether they've got a good outcome. We might want to also ask about a number of other things, like whether they enjoyed the course, which bits they found useful, and so on. So this theory of change guides us both to the design of the intervention, the instructional design of the intervention, but it also guides us to the actual ways that we can measure that. So the next job then is to think about your intervention and construct your own theory of change. So what are you going to monitor? What do you do? What happens next? And so on. And so building a theory of change like this is a very useful activity, and I'd really advise you to have a go at this. So the next thing that we want to look at is when we're thinking about outcomes and impacts, what do we mean by that? So, well, the first thing that we can think of, this is a very useful framework that I found for thinking about impacts and outcomes when we're involved in evaluation. The first thing we can say is, did we actually invest the time and resources to make the course happen? And that may seem a kind of an obvious or silly thing to say, but it's very clear that many people talk about things but don't actually do them. And so the first level of impact that we might want to say is, have we actually spent the time to make it happen? And then we can say, actually, did anybody use it? So it's very easy to create, particularly an e-learning resource, and to put it online and for no one to ever look at it. So what's been the take-up? What's been the usage of this resource? And then what kind of reaction did we get? What did people think of it? Did they like it? Did they hate it? Did they find it useful? And more important than that, did they learn anything from it? So it's very possible for us to give people things that they find a fun way to spend 15 minutes, but did they actually learn anything they didn't know from it? Well, we can test and find that out. And really importantly, do we have any behavior change as a result of this? Have people actually, through their learning, have they done things differently? So it's very common for us to be able to describe how we might write a CV or how we might apply for a job. And for a learner to be able to understand that, to be able to write down the information, to have learnt it, but not then to put it in practice. And so we want actual behaviour change as well. And then finally, we want to have some kind of results. We want something to happen as a result of the behaviour change. So yes, they've been doing all the things you've said, but has that made them more likely to get a job, to sign up for a course, to whatever it might be? We've also got a final level here which looks at return on investment. So this is really starting to get into some quite deep kinds of evaluation where we might think about what has happened as a result of it, but also was it worth the amount of investment that we put in at the beginning? So have we, as a result of doing this, have we got a result that's effective in terms of our investment? Now, an example of that might be we might be able to make a certain thing happen. So for example, we might be able to find a way to get people to apply for more jobs. But if in doing that, we have to spend vast amounts of time and money on doing that, it may not be worth that outcome. There may be more efficient ways to do that. And so this return on investment level starts us to think about those kinds of things. So the important thing is all of these levels of impact matter. As you move up these levels, they can get more difficult to measure or assess. And so it's sometimes people can reject the idea of doing evaluation because certain things are difficult. Well, you can always measure the lower levels of this. You can always find out what you've done, whether anyone's used it, what they thought of it. The further levels are more difficult to measure, but they're worth thinking about. So I think your process when you're evaluating should be to try and push up gradually the kind of quality or depth of the levels of impact that you're monitoring. Okay, so for the final thing, I think, is to make use of your evaluation. Now, it's really easy to produce an evaluation report and just to have it sit on a shelf. No one really uses it. So I think there's some basic things that you should try and do. So first thing is finish it. Of course, you don't just want to take some details off people and never do anything with it. So make sure you finish the evaluation that you're working on. Write it up into some form. It doesn't have to be a long report, but make sure that there's some way that the thinking that you've done through the evaluation is summarized in writing or a PowerPoint presentation or something like that. Send it to people. It's important that your evaluation is not just only information for you, it needs to be information for everyone who's involved in this program. And you might want to do that by putting it on the agenda of a meeting or even setting up a meeting to discuss the evaluation. If you're feeling more ambitious, you might think, well, is there a way we can publish this? That really links the evaluation back into the wider kind of research that we started off talking about. It's really useful to have lots of evaluations of programs published, because then we can try and draw these together and turn them into kind of research findings that are useful more generally. And finally, it's worth remembering that not everyone will read everything you do, and the kind of summary that you might do for a learner might be very different than you might do for somebody who's a senior decision maker in your organization. And so you want to produce some bespoke summaries for different kinds of audiences. And really this takes us back to this idea of the cycle of improvement. We started off with the idea we were planning, we were doing, we were checking, and then we were acting. And the process of finishing your evaluation, writing it up, sharing it with people, and deciding what to do about it really links you back into this cycle of continuous improvement. So thank you for listening. There's some resources here that you might find useful. And to summarize, I would say evaluation is a crucial part of your work as an e-guidance professional, integrated guidance professional. You should always start any development by building on existing evidence. But you should also identify an evaluation approach and think about how you do it. Evaluation is not something you do just at the end, it's an ongoing process. And using a theory of change can help you to structure an evaluation effectively. And finally, and most importantly, make use of your evaluation. It doesn't always have to be hugely ambitious, but it's really important that you do something with it. Thank you for listening.